The tension in the room thickened as Chris moved to the table and sat at the head of it, taking a long look at the other guests before glancing at Marissa. His stare lingered on her, too long, too focused. Rebecca returned to her seat without saying a word, and the dinner continued. But Marissa felt it now more than ever. Something was off. Her instincts were screaming at her, telling her that something was terribly wrong. She had been alone with these people for far too long now, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were all hiding something. And the more she looked at Chris, the more she realized that he wasn't just another guest. He wasn't a guest at all. Chris was a predator. The evening stretched on, but every moment felt stretched thin, like the silence between them was too much to bear. Every casual conversation felt like a trap, every glance between the men and Rebecca like a piece of a puzzle she wasn't able to solve. It was as if she was a spectator in a game that she didn't understand, one where the stakes were higher than she could ever imagine. Her thoughts were interrupted by a loud knock at the front door. This time, it wasn't just a casual ring, it was an urgent, forceful knock. Everyone in the room froze. Chris's eyes darted to the door, his jaw tightening. Derek stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'll get it," he said, his voice low. But Marissa saw the slight quiver in his hand as he grabbed the doorknob. He was just a little too eager to open it. "Don't," Marissa whispered, though she wasn't sure what she was trying to say. But Derek didn't hesitate. He swung the door open, revealing a tall figure standing in the darkness of the doorway, silhouetted against the porch light. Marissa's heart skipped a beat as the figure stepped forward, his face illuminated by the flickering light. He was wearing a mask. The masked figure stood motionless in the doorway, a dark silhouette that seemed to absorb the light around him. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind rustling outside, the faint hum of a car passing by. Marissa's heart pounded in her chest. Something wasn't right. The air in the room felt colder, thicker, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Derek's voice broke the silence, but it sounded strained. "Who are you?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step forward, his boots making a low, ominous thud on the wooden floor. With deliberate slowness, he removed his mask. Marissa's breath caught in her throat as the man's face was revealed. It was familiar, but only in a haunting way. The man standing in front of her was someone she had never met, but someone whose presence haunted her memories. His dark eyes, cold and calculating, met hers with a chilling intensity. He wasn't just an intruder, he was someone she had seen before. It took a second for the realization to hit her. This man, the one standing at the threshold of the house, was the same man who had been watching her earlier in the parking lot, the one who had been following her from the moment she stepped off that plane. Chris, still seated at the table, didn't flinch. In fact, he almost seemed pleased. His lips curled into a small, menacing smile. It was as if this moment had been carefully orchestrated from the beginning, a plan that was now coming to fruition. Rebecca, who had been silent until now, suddenly stood up, her expression unreadable. "You should have stayed away," she said, her voice hard. The masked man stepped into the house fully, brushing past Derek, who seemed hesitant to stop him. The man ignored Marissa completely, his attention now focused entirely on the others in the room. "You think this is over?" The man's voice was low, almost a growl. "This is just the beginning." A cold shiver ran down Marissa's spine. She felt like a spectator, her body frozen as she watched the drama unfold in front of her. She had been invited to a dinner, an innocent evening, but it had spiraled into something unthinkable. And now, trapped in this unfamiliar house with people she couldn't trust, she had no idea what was coming next. Rebecca's face hardened. "You don't have the power here." The man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "I never needed power. You've all underestimated me." He turned to Derek, his eyes narrowing. "Did you really think you could hide this from me? From us?" The room seemed to shrink as the tension built. Chris was watching silently, his face unreadable, while Rebecca remained eerily calm. But Derek, the one who had invited her, was starting to crack. His hands trembled, his composure faltering. "Get out," Derek finally spat, though his voice lacked conviction. "You're not welcome here." The man's eyes gleamed. "Too late for that," he said softly, then he raised a hand to the back of his coat, pulling out a gun. Marissa's stomach dropped, her blood turning to ice. The world around her seemed to slow down, and all she could hear was the heavy thrum of her own heartbeat. This wasn't just a simple dinner anymore. It was a standoff. A deadly game of cat and mouse, and she was caught in the middle of it. "Everyone sit down," the man commanded, his tone flat, as if he had done this countless times before. Derek, now visibly shaking, obeyed. He sat down at the table, his face pale and slick with sweat. Rebecca followed suit, but her eyes never left the man. She was calm, controlled, too controlled. Marissa felt her breath quicken, her chest tightening as she watched everything unfold. She glanced at the door, at the window, but she knew there was no way out. The house was too isolated, and the storm outside only made it more difficult to escape. "You really thought you could control this situation?" the man said to Derek, almost mocking him. "You thought you could trick us? You brought her here, just like we told you to." Marissa's mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. They'd known about her. They'd been watching her, from the moment she landed, maybe even before. This wasn't a random attack, it was planned, orchestrated. She wasn't just caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, she had been chosen. The man turned to face Marissa now, his eyes narrowing as if appraising her like prey. "You're the key, aren't you?" he said, his voice chillingly soft. "But you won't stop what's coming. No one can." Derek's voice was barely a whisper. "Please, don't hurt her." The man didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked down at the gun in his hand, admiring it almost. "The question is," he said, his gaze flicking back up to Marissa, "what are you willing to do to survive?" Marissa's pulse raced as the weight of his words hit her. She wasn't just a bystander anymore. She was part of this twisted game, a game where survival was the ultimate prize. And as the seconds ticked by, she realized something else: the only way to escape alive was to fight back. But how? The room was a pressure cooker, the heat from the tension making it almost unbearable. Marissa felt the weight of the man's gaze on her, a steady, suffocating force that made her muscles lock up. Every part of her screamed to run, to fight, to do anything, but her body betrayed her, rooted to the spot by fear. The man's eyes were still fixed on her, waiting. He seemed to enjoy the fear that dripped from the room like poison, savoring it like a rare delicacy. Marissa tried to steady her breathing, her mind racing. She couldn't let her fear control her. She had to think. She had to survive. Derek sat there, a shadow of the man he had been earlier, shaking like a leaf. His head was bowed, shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him as the situation unfolded. Rebecca, on the other hand, was the picture of stoicism, her face a mask of unreadable emotion. She didn't speak, didn't flinch, just sat there as if this was all somehow familiar. But Marissa's attention was entirely on the man in front of her. His gun, his cold eyes, the deliberate way he stood like he owned the space, he wasn't just a stranger. He was a predator. The man tilted his head slightly, as if to savor her discomfort. "You think this is a game, don't you?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can talk your way out of this?" Marissa wanted to speak, to say something, but the words caught in her throat. Her hands, clenched tightly in her lap, were trembling. She fought the instinct to scream, to run, to do anything other than sit there, as powerless as the others. But deep down, she knew this was not the time for panic. Then, out of nowhere, a sound broke the tense stillness. Rebecca's chair scraped against the floor as she stood up, her eyes narrowing, every muscle in her body taut with silent defiance. The man's gaze snapped to her immediately, his hand tightening around the gun. "Sit down," he commanded, his voice colder now, with an edge of warning. But Rebecca didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her voice low but fierce. "No. We're not afraid of you." There was a moment of silence. Marissa's eyes flicked between the two of them, the man's hand still firmly holding the gun. The standoff was escalating, and she could feel it, like the calm before a storm. The man took a step forward, his movements slow but deliberate. "You're all just distractions," he said, as though talking to himself. "The only thing that matters now is her." His eyes returned to Marissa, and for the first time since he entered the house, there was no mask of indifference on his face. There was something else, something cold and calculated, and it sent a chill straight down Marissa's spine. "What do you want from me?" she finally managed to ask, her voice shaking slightly. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who knew that the answer to her question was much worse than she could possibly imagine. "You're not here by accident," he said. "This is all part of the plan." Marissa's mind spun. She had known something was off ever since she'd gotten that unexpected invitation from Derek, but now the truth was becoming all too clear. She wasn't just trapped in this house because of a random encounter, she was part of something much darker, much more deliberate. The man turned back to Derek, his gaze piercing. "You thought you could hide it, but you can't. This was never about dinner. This was about sending a message." Derek's face went even paler, and he slumped further in his chair. I didn't mean for this to happen," he stammered, his voice full of regret and fear. "Please, don't hurt anyone. Just let us go." The man ignored him, walking slowly around the room. His presence felt suffocating, his footsteps heavy and purposeful as he circled like a predator stalking his prey. "I've been watching you all for a long time," he continued, his voice smooth and low, carrying the weight of years of patience. "And tonight, everything comes full circle." Marissa felt the air grow heavier with each word. She knew what he meant, this was no random crime, no isolated event. It was something carefully planned, something that had been set in motion long before she stepped into this house. The realization hit her like a punch in the gut. The man had been watching her, planning for this moment. She wasn't just a victim of chance, she was caught in the middle of something far bigger. The tension in the room was unbearable, and the moment seemed to stretch on forever, until finally, Rebecca moved again. This time, she wasn't just standing, she was walking toward the man, her eyes locked on his, her steps firm and unwavering. The man didn't seem to notice her approach at first, too wrapped up in his own words and his own plans. But as Rebecca drew closer, he finally turned toward her, his face twisted in a mix of surprise and irritation. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly. Rebecca stopped a mere few feet from him. "I'm not letting you win," she said simply, her voice strong, confident. "You're not in control here." Marissa felt her heart race. She had no idea what Rebecca was planning, but in that moment, she knew one thing for sure, this wasn't going to end without a fight. The man narrowed his eyes, his lips curling into a sneer. "You want to play hero?" he taunted. "You'll regret it." Rebecca didn't answer. Instead, she made her move. Rebecca's sudden movement caught the man off guard. As she lunged at him, she knocked his gun arm aside with a powerful push. For a brief moment, the weapon swerved away from her, and she used that precious second to her advantage. The tension exploded in the room like a thunderclap, and chaos erupted. The man staggered back, shocked by the unexpected attack. His grip on the gun faltered, and Marissa could see the fear in his eyes, fear of losing control. He hadn't anticipated anyone willing to fight back. But Rebecca didn't hesitate. She was already in motion, stepping forward with an intensity that seemed to draw on years of unspoken resilience. "Run!" Rebecca shouted to Marissa and Derek, her voice firm, commanding. Marissa's heart raced as she processed the command. She had been frozen in place, stunned by Rebecca's bravery and the sudden burst of action. But now, with the man off balance, her instincts kicked in. She grabbed Derek's arm and yanked him toward the nearest exit. But as they started to move, the man regained his balance and swung the gun back around, aiming directly at them. "No!" Rebecca screamed, diving in front of the barrel just as the man fired. The shot rang out, the deafening sound cutting through the chaos like a razor. Rebecca collapsed to the floor with a muffled cry, her body crumpling in slow motion. Time seemed to stretch as Marissa's world turned to pure panic. Blood seeped from Rebecca's side, her breath shallow and labored, but still alive. "No!" Marissa screamed, her voice breaking. She pulled Derek back toward the room, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of the nightmare unfolding in front of her. Her legs shook with terror, and her thoughts were scrambled, but there was no time to process. The man, for the first time, looked unsure. The gun was still in his hand, but now, there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He wasn't sure what to do next. His calm facade was starting to crack, and Marissa saw an opportunity. She didn't hesitate. Adrenaline coursing through her veins, she launched herself toward him, grabbing a vase from a nearby table and smashing it into his face. The impact was brutal, but it was enough to knock him back, disorienting him. For a moment, the man staggered, dazed by the force of the blow. His grip on the gun loosened just enough for Marissa to snatch it from his hand. With a rush of fury and fear, she aimed the weapon at him, her hands shaking with the weight of it. She didn't want to use it, but she couldn't afford to hesitate. He would kill them all if given the chance. "Don't come any closer," Marissa said, her voice trembling but steady with determination. "I will shoot." The man's eyes widened with shock, but then his lips twisted into a sneer. He knew she didn't have the experience to pull the trigger. He had underestimated her before, he wouldn't make the same mistake now. "You think you can intimidate me with that? I'm in control here," he snarled, stepping forward. Marissa's finger tightened on the trigger, but then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw Rebecca move again. Slowly, her hand reached into her jacket pocket. She was reaching for something. A knife? A phone? Marissa couldn't tell, but she prayed it was something that could turn the tide. In that crucial moment, Rebecca's voice rang out, weak but forceful, "Shoot him, Marissa." It was the final nudge Marissa needed. The instinct to protect, to end this nightmare, overwhelmed everything else. With a deep breath, she squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out again, louder this time, the deafening noise ringing in her ears. The man fell backward, his face contorted in surprise and pain, his body slamming against the wall with a sickening thud. The gun clattered to the floor as he slid to the ground. Marissa stood there, frozen, her chest heaving with ragged breaths. Her hands were still gripping the gun, but the adrenaline was beginning to ebb away. She felt her legs go weak, but she couldn't let herself collapse, not yet. "Rebecca," she whispered, her voice breaking. Derek was already by her side, his face pale with shock as he knelt beside Rebecca, trying to staunch the bleeding from her wound. "She's still alive," he said, his voice shaky but relieved. "We need to get her help." Marissa barely heard him as she stared at the man's lifeless body, her mind still reeling from the adrenaline. He had been the threat, the catalyst for the chaos, but now there was an eerie calm in the air. The storm had passed, but the damage was done. Rebecca groaned, her eyes fluttering open. "You did it," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with gratitude. "You saved us." Marissa's heart surged with a mix of relief and disbelief. They had made it out alive. But the victory didn't feel like a triumph. The cost had been too high. As Derek tried to stabilize Rebecca, Marissa knew that this Christmas would never be the same for any of them. In the following hours, help arrived. Police, paramedics, and the unsettling reality of what had transpired filled the house. Marissa's mind was foggy as she gave her statement to the officers, her body still shaking from the aftermath. But her heart knew that despite the horrors they had endured, they had survived. They had made it out. They had fought back. Rebecca was rushed to the hospital, her injuries critical but not life-threatening. Derek, though shaken to the core, was okay, physically at least. He had been lucky. But the memories of that night would haunt them all. The officers questioned them, but their focus was mostly on the body of the man who had threatened them. They identified him as a notorious criminal who had been on the run for years, someone who had slipped through the cracks too many times to count. He wasn't just a random killer, he had a long history of violence, and his presence here had been part of a larger scheme, a plan that had now failed. As Marissa sat in the hospital waiting room, her mind replayed the events over and over, like a film stuck on repeat. She couldn't erase the fear, the violence, the chaos. But she could hold on to one thing: she was alive. They were alive. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, the weight lifting from her chest. They had survived Christmas Eve. Weeks later, the hospital room felt quieter, calmer. Rebecca had healed, her wound nothing more than a scar now, a reminder of what they had been through. Derek had returned to his usual self, albeit with a quiet edge of caution that hadn't been there before. Marissa looked at them both and smiled, feeling a sense of gratitude for their friendship and the bond that had been forged through the darkest of circumstances. Christmas would never feel the same, but they had something to hold on to, a new understanding of just how precious life truly was. And as for the killer, his name was forgotten, his memory fading into the background of the lives he had tried to destroy. What remained was the strength of three people who had come together and fought for their survival, a bond that no one could take away. They didn't need a holiday to remind them of the gift of life. They had already received it. It seemed that for Marissa, Rebecca, and Derek, Christmas was no longer just about festivities and gifts. It had morphed into something more profound, a time of reckoning, of survival, and of appreciation for the fragile moments they had with each other. As they gathered together for a quiet New Year's celebration, no one spoke much of the past. The holidays felt different now, tinged with the weight of what they had been through, but also marked by the healing that was slowly taking place in each of them. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever could be after a night like that, but it was enough. Rebecca, though scarred, was still the strong-willed woman Marissa had come to know. She had a smile on her face, even if it wasn't as carefree as before. Derek, who had been so shaken after the ordeal, now seemed more grounded, the cloud of fear that had followed him lifting as the days went on. And Marissa? She had learned something profound about herself that night, about the strength and courage that resided within, even when all seemed lost. She had discovered that survival wasn't just about staying alive, but about rising above, despite the darkness that threatened to swallow her. Together, they had lived through a nightmare that would never be fully erased. But they had also found a deeper connection, a bond that was forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. As the clock struck midnight on New Year's Eve, they raised their glasses, not to the past, but to the future, a future where they knew they could survive anything, as long as they had each other. The night, once marred by terror, now held a quiet peace. And though they couldn't forget the horrors they had endured, they had also learned to cherish the simple moments of life, moments of love, friendship, and the beauty of being alive. The nightmare was over, and they had emerged stronger, together. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this intense story of survival, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales. And be sure to check out the other gripping videos on the screen. You won't want to miss what's coming next.